Next, on Investigative Report. Lethal arms. The Second Amendment under attack. An ever-increasing wave of attacks against the most vulnerable portion of our society has caused nationwide protests against the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. Today, many find it hard to imagine the reasoning behind the Revolutionary War for the founders' enshrinement of personal protection. But the Supreme Court has unwaveringly upheld as sacred to the Constitution the Second Amendment as strongly as the First. This despite police calls to limit the size of street weapons and lethal ammunition they face, as well as strengthening their hands against militia they believe would do public harm. As weapons of combat have become commonplace on American streets, so has the policing effort represented itself as soldiers on the battlefield of American streets against its own citizens. 20 years ago, Representative Tom DeLay referred to these agents who brutally enforced the government's will as jackbooted thugs. And now, lethal arms. The Second Amendment under attack. There is literally no greater divisive issue in America outside of abortion than the Second Amendment. The second, more than any other, drives, shapes policies as well as the nightly news. In land recognized for freedom of speech, the debate rages in street protests for and against the right to bear arms. But are these debates based on fact or a slippery slope to surrendering liberties guaranteed to all in the Constitution? Now, a large swath of Americans insist that all weapons should be done away with. Now, this is in order to make streets safer for everyone. While others insist we need more lethal arms to defend the freedoms we already have in that sacred document given to us by the founders. Typically, these conflicting philosophies originate from the far extremes of the debate. But in the middle, where two contradicting philosophies collide, is the truth. And that is, most people would choose not to live in fear without a means of defense. There's no need to take a knife to a gunfight. You see, in truth, it is highly likely to live a balance between both extremes, and the following example would should bear that out. In our investigation, we uncovered that the vast majority of gun violence committed on the streets of America is not by permitted gun owners. Without exception, the greater majority of gun violence we researched came from people who illegally purchased firearms and ammunition outside of normal channels, outside of background checks, outside of any kind of check. These homicides and shootings fuel gun arguments and attacks against the National Rifle Association. Now, this show does not back the National Rifle Association or any other organization. Although the National Rifle Association bills itself as a gun rights safety and advocacy group, it has become a lightning rod for criticism of late. Now, people see this 151-year-old agency as a barrier to Congress passing more gun-restrictive laws to protect the general public. As of late, the NRA's revenue declined 23%, roughly $367 million in the year 2016, to $282 million in 2020, prompting calls for change in leadership. Contributions to the agency and grants from members from corporations also slipped by 15% during that same time period. The NRA's board of directors voted earlier that year to re-elect the longtime CEO, Wayne LaPierre, signaling the gun rights group isn't changing direction despite a rise in mass shootings and its own internal turmoil. You see, LaPierre has been in charge of NRA day-to-day operations almost since the early 1990s. And has shaped his no-compromise approach to lobbying against gun control, even after New York's Attorney General accused him of using the group as his personal piggy bank. Now, a sea change in the way modern America views gun ownership places the NRA and the Second Amendment squarely in the crosshairs of things that are outdated. You're watching M&N, the Men's Channel. But the simple fact is that if we destroyed all legal guns tomorrow, it would not prevent those who attain them illegally, just as they did the day before. In countries where personal gun rights were abolished, followed by higher incidents of stabbings and death by knives. The only thing that the abolishment of the right to bear arms in America would cause is an easier mark to be robbed or killed in most people's estimation. The right to bear arms in part symbolizes now what it always has, and that is that right to be protected in your home from harm. In this country, as in any other, there are not enough police officers to go to every single crime scene after they are committed. In most instances, before the police can respond to your 911 call, you will be the only defense that stands between the perpetrator and injury to your family and home. Last year in America, there were over 250 million 911 calls for service. Responding to those service calls were 696,644 full-time law enforcement officers. Of that number, 129 officers were killed in the line of defense, protecting the general public. We submit just one example to show you why you are on your own when it comes to protection during a violent conflict on a broader scale. In the state of California, there are approximately 148,000 police officers. Now in that same state, there's a total population of 39 million people for the current year. Mathematically, this means that you have a 0.0038 chance of being defended by that police base during a crime in a state that has a citizen base broader than the police that defend it. The same thing goes for the military in this great country. The United States has approximately 380 million residents at the last census count. The total number of uniformed soldiers of all branches, including Army, the Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard, to defend that population is approximately 1.5 million uniformed individuals. So contrary to popular belief, the Second Amendment was written and still exists so you can defend yourself and not wait for someone to come and rescue you when you need it. During the middle of this year, the largest march against the right to own assault rifles was held in June 11 at the mall in Washington, D.C. It was there that the event organizers allowed the construction of a visual aid that would sure to get the public's attention. Now, in these pictures shown here, they would gather together over 1,100 fake body bags to spell out the words, thoughts, and prayers. This slogan, above all else, spelled out, would come to mock the comments, political leaders in Congress, and the White House who had done little in their belief to curb the violence and mass shootings. Now, there's little that you can do from a government body to reduce that because it's on an individual, case-by-case basis. Most mass shootings start at home and then they go out to the general public. But a large wrinkle in the push to eliminate assault rifles and the Second Amendment was that a vast majority of women who marched in that event on June 11 couldn't foresee that they were about to lose a right they saw as sacred a mere 13 days later after that event. On June 24, 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States would have finally codified in its early opinion concerning abortion law. That decision would split the court conservatives against liberals that abortion was not a constitutional right. By the time the crowds gathered at the Supreme Court to protest their demands, their voices would fall on deaf ears because the Constitution allows the Supreme Court's decisions to stand as the unquestionable law of the land. There's no regress for that particular body. Now, this judiciary branch is the only body of our three-pronged government that you cannot change through midterm elections or public protests. It will just not change their minds. So it would appear as if these protesters would have used better energy in fighting to keep the right to bear arms instead of surrendering them to a government that enjoys restricting personal freedom. The Second Amendment is there to protect the First Amendment. Now, I'm sure it came as a complete surprise that their same nation struck down a perceived right governing natural birth, or what was called abortion. Now, this is why one should never petition a government to remove any right that exists to benefit everyone equally. You see, at one time in the United States of America, African Americans in bondage were denied the right to have a weapon because they were deemed as property, and this was after the Constitution had already been drawn up and ratified. They There's no way that a property can own a weapon. A dog is considered property. Your home is property. Now, naming a citizen as property was a brilliant scheme to circumvent the Second Amendment and control a person without them putting up as much armed resistance. Brilliant. Those rights would be hard fought by black citizens for over 100 years before the right to bear arms was actually respected by that community as Americans.
First Amendment rights are what you call passive rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. All of those are passive rights that you have. But the Founding Fathers also knew that something had to be there to make sure that it could not be taken away. And that's why they gave us a Second Amendment right as an active right to keep that. Because history has shown the government, ruled by men and women, can sometimes be nefarious in nature, can seek their own self-interest or their own special interests at the expense of citizens. And that's why that Second Amendment is there.
Well, I'd give up my gun when everybody else does.
And is that
Does that make sense?
Well,
doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you were to, if there were guns here, would you want to be the only person without one?
So do you carry guns
No,
routinely at home? I mean, you have a gun at home?
Yeah, it's legal in the United States. It's part of our Constitution. You know, the right to bear arms is because that's the last form of defense against tyranny. Not to hunt. It's to protect yourself from the police.
And do you see any link between that and these sorts of incidents?
No. Nah, not really. You know what I'm saying? If somebody wants to kill people, you know, they don't need a gun to do it.
Makes it easier though, doesn't it?
Not really. You can use you can strap explosives on your body. They do that all the time.
So when there's the inevitable backlash of the anti-gun lobby as a result of this incident, as there always is.
Well, that's not going to change anything
It's
in the
not gonna
United
change.
States. No. The United States is based on guns. You know, like KRS says, you'll never have justice on stolen land. So it's not going to change.
I didn't have time to, I didn't have the resource of an English teacher to sit down and write a speech with at school today and be, brought over here and practice or anything. What I really came down here for is this. I've heard a whole lot of people in here talking tonight about this group and that group, and domestic violence, and blacks, these minorities and that minority. What I want to know is, when are you all going to start standing up for the majority? And here's who the majority is. I'm the majority. I'm a law-abiding citizen who's never shot anybody, never committed a serious crime, never committed a felony. I've never done anything like that. But it seems like every time we have one of these shootings, nobody wants to put the blame where it goes, which is at the shooter's feet. You want to put it at my feet. You want to turn around and restrict my right, constitutional right that's spelled out in black and white. You want to restrict my right to buy a firearm and protect myself from some of the very people you're talking about in here tonight. It's ridiculous. I don't think Rod Serling could come up with a better script. It does not make any sense. The law-abiding citizens of this community and many communities around this country, we're the first ones taxed and the last ones considered and the first ones punished when things like this happens, because our rights are the ones that are being taken away. That's the reason why I came out here today. Gun show or no gun show, NRA or no NRA. I'm here to stand up for the law-abiding citizens of this community, because I'm going to tell you that what's going to happen. You can take the guns away from us all you want to. You all write a law, I follow the law, I'll bring my guns down here, I'll turn them in. But here's what's going to happen. The Crips and the Bloods on the other side of town, they're not going to turn their guns in. They're going to hold on to them. And what's going to happen when you have to send the police down there to go take them? The police can barely enforce the law as it is. That's what I see. We demonize the police, criminalize and vilify the police, and we make the criminals into victims. And we're talking about restricting guns? How are you going to do that? How are you going to do that when the police department's already hamstrung? You're not going to be able to go down here and take these guns from these criminals. So the criminals are going to hold on to their guns. They're still going to have them. They're still going to break in my house, and they're still going to shoot me with them. And guess who's going to be the one that suffers? It's going to be me. Well, I'm here to tell you tonight, It is not going to happen without a fight. And when I say fight, I don't mean shots fired. I don't mean fist thrown. I mean, I'm going to come down here to this city council and raise hell just like these loonies from the left do until you listen to the majority of the people in this city. And I am the majority. The majority of the people in this city are law-abiding. And they follow the law, and they want their constitutional right to be able to bear arms. They want to be able to go to the gun show and buy a hunting rifle or sport rifle. There are no military-grade weapons sold at the gun show. An AR-15 is not a military-grade weapon. Anybody who would go into combat with an AR-15 is a fool. It's a semi-automatic 22 rifle. You'd be killed in 15 minutes in combat with that thing. So we need to dispel all these myths, and we need to drop all this division that we got going on here. Because the bottom line is, when that Second Amendment was written, whether the framers liked it or not, they wrote it for everybody. And I am everybody. And the law-abiding citizens of this city are everybody. And we want our rights, and we want to keep our rights. And by God, we're going to keep them, come hell or high water.
And indeed, women, similar to the marchers on June 11, did not have the right to bear arms either until the year 1919. In the gender of women, there are currently over 22% of the weapons owned legally in the United States. So 22% of weapons owned in the United States are by women. So when the women protested against the right to bear arms, they protested against their own gender. Now, many of those female owners, as men, insist that the Second Amendment exists to ensure our First Amendment, and in a sense, they are right. The framers of the Constitution wrote much of that document as a slap in the face to King George III, because the British monarchy would have never allowed many of the provisions in that particular constitutional document. No. Under the control of the king, there would have been no right to the unlimited free speech. It would have never existed. There would be no right to bear arms. And there would have been no safety from a legal search and seizure of your home, which the right to bear arms protects that. As I said before, the entire document, meaning the Constitution, was to give not only freedom to the American people, but to let the people, instead of a king or a dictator, run the country. So in essence, when the framers gave the right of the Second Amendment, you should never ask them to take it away. The founders felt that citizens should be able to protect themselves against the government and any other threat to their well-being or personal freedoms. The Second Amendment granted citizens that right, giving them the ability to defend themselves and their property. Not that they were property, but to defend their property. But was this always the law of the land? Did the colonists have the right to bear arms? Colonial statutes established a duty to keep and bear arms for the defense of the colonies, and regulated the use of arms in circulation. The American Revolution in turn provided fertile ground for the growth of the concept of the right of the Revolution and related right to bear arms. And I'll get into this in a minute on why we have never moved away from that. It's just not for an attacking body. Now, because the individual colonies did not have enough money to purchase weapons, each man was required to maintain a firearm so he could report immediately for duty and form a militia. Now, today you have a military to protect you. And I explained a minute ago why there's not enough military citizens in uniform to protect an entire country. Bearing arms is essential to peace when it comes to the defense of one's homeland. I am a Gulf War veteran myself, and that conflict was hard won, but outright hands down by the United States. But it was when we returned to that same country a second time that I knew America would face stiff resistance. Why? Because you can always defeat an army, but you can never defeat a people. I say again, you can always defeat an army, but you can never defeat a people. Armies assemble out in the open battlefield and therefore can be easily defeated. But it's when you get to a major city and houses where citizens have the right to bear arms that they will snipe you from every rooftop and every window. This is essentially what is taking place as I speak right now in the country of Ukraine. When average men and women take up personal arms in the cause of defense, their homeland, it will make it much harder for an invading power to defeat that country. The military may already be defeated, but the citizen will not. And this is precisely why no foreign power would ever attempt to take over this country. Why? Why, you might ask? Because every citizen in America has a right to bear arms, and foreign militaries know full well that people will snipe them from every rooftop or every building in perpetuity. There's no way to take over a country this large with everybody with the right to bear arms. But then I can hear others there saying that guns are killing our children and people in inner cities. Once again, I have to say that I've fired many weapons in my military service, including an M16, grenade launcher, 45 caliber pistol, an M25 machine gun, an M50 light armor machine gun, the main gun on a Bradley armored fighting vehicle, as well as many other weapons I won't name here. None of these weapons alone killed anybody by themselves. And as soldiers, we carry a healthy respect for using and firing these lethal weapons around people. Now, this is something that you don't see in civilian life. All the time you see people pointing guns at people and trying to make them scared. But in military, we don't do that. We never aim the business end of a weapon towards anybody. Now, there are others that profess on television news and talk shows that the reason that there is more violence in the street is that minorities don't have full employment, and that this is why they commit more gun violence. But the facts provided by the Center for Disease Control, the U.S. government, and the National Suicide Hotline do not bear these facts out. If our leaders in Washington and all of the state houses were actually honest with us, they would tell us that there are more suicides each year by gun than murders. I say again, there are more suicides each year in America than murders by gun. This is true year over year for the last quarter of a century.
We examine a snapshot view of the murder rate from 1999 to the year 2017 for America. The bottom line is the murder rate by firearms. In comparison, the top line is the suicide rate by firearm for the very same year. Notice which one is greater at all times and which year they completely diverge from one another. From these graphs, one could easily surmise that America has a higher suicide rate over murder rate.
If those leaders were honest, they would tell you that not only do we possess more guns than we do people in this country, but that people who use those guns to kill mainly exist in major cities where overcrowding leads to using a weapon to defend your ground, or how people choose to exact revenge in a heated state. They will tell you that there are fewer gun crimes in the middle states and even fewer in the northern portion of the United States. In fact, most weapons discharged in anger, revenge, or defense takes place more in southern cities than they do in the north.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
But I imagine if they told you the truth, they would also have to tell you that it is not a bad economy that sees more gun violence, but a good economy. You see, we have investigated every election cycle since 1999 in which a candidate promised to create more jobs for lower income communities to limit the gun violence that takes place there. But by the U.S. government's very own statistics, it would seem like the best economy sees the highest annual murder rate, along with the lower suicide rate for the same time period. Conversely, the worst economies witness a lower murder rate and a much higher suicide rate. On an interesting side note, it did not matter which party was in power at that particular time, but rather which economy dominated people's opinion of the use of a gun. For example, the murder rate in the year 1999 was 10,828 persons by firearm, while the suicide rate for the same time period was 16,599 persons by firearm. Much more. As I said before, suicide by gun will always outpace murders by the same instrument. The unemployment rate for the year 1999 was 4.2%. The total number of people unemployed for the time period was 5.7 million persons, and the total number of people seeking unemployment insurance was 2.5 million people during the Clinton administration. Let's fast forward to the year 2009, when the Great Recession had really begun to hit its stride, and you will see a precipitous drop in the murders and an astronomical increase in the suicide rate. Now, correcting for a growth rate of about 5 percentage points annually and both categories saw a murder rate of 11,493 persons in the year 2009, the year Obama faced the Great Recession, and a suicide rate of 18,735 people. Now, this is an interesting fact, in that just 2 years before, when the economy was in a better position, the murder rate was 12,632 persons, and the suicide rate by gun was 18,735 persons by firearm, and this pattern continues to repeat itself even to this day. So a better economy introduces more murders into the stream, while suicides decrease and vice versa. To this, I would say, do not trust a leader who says that they can take down the murder rate on their watch by placing more police on the streets, because they could be signaling that they are going to take down the economy, which will in essence take down the murder rate and increase the suicide rate. The only oddity to this measure was during the last COVID pandemic, in which the number of murders jumped 35% to 19,000 in 2020. Odder still is the fact that the suicide rate, that normally goes up in bad times, remained exactly the same year over year for the same time period. Some might say it was because 20 million guns were sold in 2020, up from 12.4 million sold the year before. But the amount of sales to murders is not indicated when you already have roughly more than 398 million guns in circulation in the United States of America. The truth of the matter is that we have more guns in this country than we literally do people who can own those weapons. For Investigative Report, this is Charles Rivers. Thank you for watching.